Join me, Tony Walker, narrator of the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, this week as we read W.F. Harvey's The Beast with Five Fingers. We enter the world of Eustace Borlsover, an eccentric gentleman immersed in the study of the natural world and its more unusual phenomena. Set within the quiet gloom of Borlsover Conyers, his ancestral home, the story gradually evolves into a tale of obsession and nightmare. What if part of our very selves could act with a will of its own and meant us harm? Join me as we step into a place where reason begins to unravel, where dust settles thick on forgotten shelves, and where something spiderlike begins to crawl across the library bookshelves in the dark depths of the night.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret of the dead come back?
The story, I suppose, begins with Adrian Borlsover, whom I met when I was a little boy and he an old man. My father had called to appeal for a subscription, and before he left, Mr. Borlsover laid his right hand in blessing on my head. I shall never forget the awe in which I gazed up at his face and realized, for the first time, that eyes might be dark and beautiful and shining, and yet not able to see. For Adrian Borlsover was blind. He was an extraordinary man who came of an eccentric stock. Borlsover's sons, for some reason, always seemed to marry very ordinary women, which perhaps accounted for the fact that no Borlsover had been a genius, and only one Borlsover had been mad. But they were great champions of little causes, generous patrons of odd sciences, founders of querulous sects, trustworthy guides to the bypath meadows of erudition. Adrian was an authority on the fertilization of orchids. He had held at one time the family living at Borlsover Conyers, until a congenital weakness of the lungs obliged him to seek a less rigorous climate in the sunny south coast watering place where I had seen him. Occasionally he would relieve one or other of the local clergy. My father described him as a fine preacher, who gave long and inspiring sermons from what many men would have considered unprofitable texts. An excellent proof, he would add, of the truth of the doctrine of direct verbal inspiration. Adrian Borlsover was exceedingly clever with his hands. His penmanship was exquisite. He illustrated all his scientific papers, made his own woodcuts, and carved a reredos that is at present the chief feature of interest in the church at Borlsover Conyers. He had an exceedingly clever knack in cutting silhouettes for young ladies and paper pigs and cows for little children, and made more than one complicated wind instrument of his own devising. When he was 50 years old, Adrian Borlsover lost his sight. In a short time he adapted himself to the new conditions of life. He quickly learned to read Braille. So marvellous indeed was his sense of touch that he was still able to maintain his interest in botany. The mere passing of his long supple fingers over a flower was sufficient means for its identification, though occasionally he would use his lips. I found several letters of his among my father's correspondence. In no case was there anything to show that he was afflicted with blindness, and this in spite of the fact that he exercised undue economy in the spacing of lines. Towards the close of his life, Adrian Borlsover was credited with powers of touch that seemed almost uncanny. It has been said that he could tell at once the colour of a ribbon placed between his fingers. My father could neither confirm nor deny this story. Adrian Borlsover was a bachelor. His elder brother Charles had married late in life, leaving one son, Eustace, who lived in the gloomy Georgian mansion at Borlsover Conyers. He worked undisturbed in collecting material for his great book on heredity. Like his uncle, he was a remarkable man. The Borlsovers had always been born naturalists, but Eustace possessed in a special degree the power of systemizing his knowledge. He had received his university education in Germany, and then, after postgraduate work in Vienna and Naples, had travelled for 4 years in South America and the East. together a huge store of material for a new study into the processes of variation. He lived alone at Borlsover Conyers, with Saunders his secretary, a man who bore a somewhat dubious reputation in the district, but whose powers as a mathematician, combined with his business abilities, were invaluable to Eustace. Uncle and nephew saw little of each other. The visits of Eustace were confined to a week in the summer or autumn, tedious weeks that dragged almost as slowly as the bath-chair in which the old man was drawn along the sunny seafront. In their way, the two men were fond of each other, though their intimacy would doubtless have been greater had they shared the same religious views. Adrian held to the old-fashioned evangelical dogmas of his early manhood. His nephew, for many years, had been thinking of embracing Buddhism. Both men possessed, too, the reticence the Borlsovers had always shown, and which their enemies sometimes called hypocrisy. With Adrian it was a reticence as to the things he had left undone, but with Eustace it seemed that the curtain which he was so careful to leave undrawn hid something more than a half-empty chamber. 2 years before his death, Adrian Borlsover developed, unknown to himself, the not uncommon power of automatic writing. Eustace made the discovery by accident. Adrian was sitting reading in bed, the forefinger of his left hand tracing the braille characters, when his nephew noticed that a pencil the old man held in his right hand was moving slowly along the opposite page. He left his seat in the window and sat down beside the bed. The right hand continued to move, and now he could see plainly that they were letters and words which it was forming. Adrian Borlsover, wrote the hand. Eustace Borlsover. Charles Borlsover, Francis Borlsover, Sigismund Borlsover, Adrian Borlsover, Eustace Borlsover, Saville Borlsover, B for Borlsover, honesty's the best policy, beautiful Belinda Borlsover. What curious nonsense, said Eustace to himself. King George ascended the throne in 1760, wrote the hand. Crowd, a noun of multitude, a collection of individuals. Adrian Borlsover, Eustace Borlsover. Seems to me, said his uncle, closing the book, that you had much better make the most of the afternoon sunshine and take your walk now. I think I perhaps will, Eustace answered as he picked up the volume. I won't go far, and when I come back I can read to you those articles in Nature about which we were speaking. He went along the promenade, but stopped at the first shelter, and seating himself in the corner best protected from the wind, he examined the book at leisure. Nearly every page was scored with a meaningless jumble of pencil marks, rows of capital letters, short words, long words, complete sentences, copybook tags. The whole thing, in fact, had the appearance of a copybook, and on a more careful scrutiny, Eustace thought that there was ample evidence to show that the handwriting at the beginning of the book, good though it was not nearly so good as the handwriting at the end. He left his uncle at the end of October with a promise to return early in December. It seemed to him quite clear that the old man's power of automatic writing was developing rapidly, and for the first time he looked forward to a visit that would combine duty with interest. But on his return he was at first disappointed. His uncle, he thought, looked older. He was listless, too, preferring others to read to him and dictating nearly all his letters. Not until the day before he had left had Eustace an opportunity of observing Adrian Borlsover's newfound faculty. The old man, propped up in bed with pillows, had sunk into a light sleep. His two hands lay on the coverlet, his left hand tightly clasping his right. Eustace took an empty manuscript book and placed a pencil within reach of the fingers of the right hand. They snatched at it eagerly, then dropped the pencil to loose the left hand from its restraining grasp. Perhaps, to prevent interference, I had better hold that hand, said Eustace to himself as he watched the pencil. Almost immediately it began to write. Blundering Borlsovers, unnecessarily unnatural, extraordinarily eccentric, culpably curious. Who are you? Asked Eustace in a low voice. Never you mind, wrote the hand of Adrian. Is it my uncle who is writing? Oh, my prophetic soul, mine uncle, is it anyone I know? Silly Eustace, you'll see me very soon. When shall I see you? When poor old Adrian's dead. Where shall I see you? Where shall you not? Instead of speaking his next question, Eustace wrote it. What is the time? The fingers dropped the pencil and moved 3 or 4 times across the paper. Then, picking up the pencil, they wrote, 10 minutes before 4. Put your book away, Eustace. Adrian mustn't find us working at this sort of thing. He doesn't know what to make of it. And I won't have poor old Adrian disturbed. Au revoir. Adrian Borlsover awoke with a start. I've been dreaming again, he said. Such queer dreams of leaguered cities and forgotten towns. You were mixed up in this one, Eustace, though I can't remember how. Eustace, I want to warn you. Don't walk in doubtful paths. Choose your friends well. Your poor grandfather... A fit of coughing put an end to what he was saying, but Eustace saw that the hand was still writing. He managed, unnoticed, to draw the book away. I'll light the gas, he said, and ring for tea. On the other side of the bed curtain he saw the last sentences that had been written. It's too late, Adrian, he said. We're friends already, aren't we, Eustace Borlsover? On the following day Eustace left. He thought his uncle looked ill when he said goodbye, and the old man spoke despondently of the failure his life had been. Nonsense, uncle, said his nephew. You have got over your difficulties in a way not 1 in 100,000 would have done. Everyone marvels at your splendid perseverance in teaching your hand to take the place of your lost sight. To me, it's been a revelation of the possibilities of education. Education, said his uncle dreamily, as if the word had started a new train of thought. Education is good, so long as you know to whom and for what purpose you give it. But with the lower orders of men, the base and more sordid spirits, I have grave doubts as to its results. Well, goodbye, Eustace. I may not see you again. You are a true Borlsover, with all the Borlsover faults. Marry, Eustace, marry some good, sensible girl, and if by any chance I don't see you again, my will is at my solicitor's. I've not left you any legacy, because I know you're well provided for, but I thought you might like to have my books. Oh, and there's just one other thing. You know, before the end, people often lose control over themselves and make absurd requests. Don't pay any attention to them, Eustace. Goodbye. And he held out his hand. Eustace took it. It remained in his a fraction of a second longer than he had expected, and gripped him with a virility that was surprising. There was, too, in its touch, a subtle sense of intimacy. Why, uncle, he said, I shall see you alive and well for many long years to come. 2 months later, Adrian Borlsover died. Eustace Borlsover was in Naples at the time. He read the obituary notice in the Morning Post on the day announced for the funeral. Poor old fellow, he said. I wonder whether I shall find room for all his books. The question occurred to him again with greater force when 3 days later he found himself standing in the library at Borlsover Conyers, a huge room built for use and not for beauty, in the year of Waterloo by a Borlsover who was an ardent admirer of the great Napoleon. It was arranged on the plan of many college libraries, with tall projecting bookcases forming deep recesses of dusty silence, fit graves for the old hates of forgotten controversy, the dead passions of forgotten lives. At the end of the room, behind the bust of some unknown 18th century divine, an ugly iron corkscrew stair led to a shelf-lined gallery. Nearly every shelf was full. I must talk to Saunders about it, said Eustace. I suppose that we shall have to have the billiard-room fitted up with bookcases. The two men met for the first time after many weeks in the dining-room that evening. "Hello," said Eustace, standing before the fire with his hands in his pockets. "How goes the world, Saunders? Why, these dress togs!" He himself was wearing an old shooting jacket. He didn't believe in mourning, as he had told his uncle on his last visit, and although he usually went in for quiet-coloured ties, he wore this evening one of an ugly red in order to shock Morton the butler, and to make them thrash out the whole question of mourning for themselves in the servants' hall. Eustace was a true Borlsover. "The world," said Saunders, "goes the same as usual, confoundedly slow. The dress togs are accounted for by an invitation from Captain Lockwood to bridge. How are you getting there?" "There's something the matter with the car, so I've told Jackson to drive me round in the dog-cart. Any objection?" "Oh, dear me, no. We have had all things in common for far too many years for me to raise objections at this hour of the day." "You'll find your correspondence in the library," went on Saunders. "Most of it I've seen to. There are a few private letters I haven't opened. There's also a box with a rat or something inside that came by the evening post. Very likely it's the 6-toed beast Terry was sending us to cross with the 4-toed albino. I didn't look because I didn't want to mess up my things, but I should gather from the way it's jumping about that it's pretty hungry." "Oh, well, I'll see to it," said Eustace, "while you and the captain earn an honest penny." Dinner over and Saunders gone, Eustace went into the library. Though the fire had been lit, the room was by no means cheerful. "We'll have all the lights on at any rate," he said as he turned the switches. "And, Morton," he added, when the butler brought the coffee, "get me a screwdriver or something to undo this box. Whatever the animal is, he's kicking up the deuce of a row. What is it? Why are you dawdling?" "If you please, sir, when the postman brought it, he told me that they'd bored the holes in the lid at the post office. There were no breathing holes in the lid, sir, and they didn't want the animal to die. That is all, sir." "It's culpably careless of the man, whoever he was," said Eustace, as he removed the screws. "Packing an animal like this in a wooden box with no means of getting air. Confound it all! I meant to ask Morton to bring me a cage to put it in. Now I suppose I shall have to get one myself." He placed a heavy book on the lid from which the screws had been removed, and went into the billiard-room. As he came back into the library with an empty cage in his hand, he heard the sound of something falling, and then of something scuttling along the floor. "Bother it, the beast's got out! How in the world am I to find it again in this library?" To search for it did indeed seem hopeless. He tried to follow the sound of the scuttling in one of the recesses where the animal seemed to be running behind the books in the shelves, but it was impossible to locate it. Eustace resolved to go on quietly reading. Very likely the animal might gain confidence and show itself. Saunders seemed to have dealt in his usual methodical manner with most of the correspondence. There were still the private letters. What was that? 2 sharp clicks, and the lights in the hideous candelabras that hung from the ceiling suddenly went out. "I wonder if something's gone wrong with the fuse," said Eustace, as he went to the switches by the door. Then he stopped. There was a noise at the other end of the room, as if something was crawling up the iron corkscrew stair. "If it's gone into the gallery," he said, "well and good." He hastily turned on the lights, crossed the room, and climbed up the stair, but he could see nothing. His grandfather had placed a little gate at the top of the stair so that children could run and romp in the gallery without fear of accident. This Eustace closed, and having considerably narrowed the circle of his search, returned to his desk by the fire. How gloomy the library was! There was no sense of intimacy about the room. The few busts that an 18th century Borlsover had brought back from the Grand Tour might have been in keeping in the old library. Here they seemed out of place. They made the room feel cold, in spite of the heavy red damask curtains and great gilt cornices. With a crash, 2 heavy books fell from the gallery to the floor. Then, as Borlsover looked, another and yet another. "Very well, you'll starve for this, my beauty," he said. "We'll do some experiments on the metabolism of rats deprived of water. Go on, chuck 'em down. I think I've got the upper hand." He turned once more to his correspondence. The letter was from the family solicitor. It spoke of his uncle's death and of the valuable collection of books that had been left to him in the will. "There was one request," he read, "which certainly came as a surprise to me. As you know, Mr. Adrian Borlsover had left instructions that his body was to be buried in as simple a manner as possible at Eastbourne. He expressed a desire that there should be neither wreaths nor flowers of any kind, and hoped that his friends and relatives would not consider it necessary to wear mourning. The day before his death, we received a letter cancelling these instructions. He wished the body to be embalmed. He gave us the address of the man we were to employ, Pennifer, Ludgate Hill, with orders that his right hand should be sent to you, stating that it was at your special request. The other arrangements about the funeral remained unaltered." "Good Lord," said Eustace, "what in the world was the old boy driving at? And what in the name of all holy's that?" Someone was in the gallery. Someone had pulled the cord attached to one of the blinds, and it had rolled up with a snap. Someone must be in the gallery, for a second blind did the same. Someone must be walking round the gallery, for one after the other the blinds sprang up, letting in the moonlight. "I haven't got to the bottom of this yet," said Eustace, "but I will do, before the night is very much older." And he hurried up the corkscrew stair. He had just got to the top when the lights went out a second time, and he heard again the scuttling along the floor. He stole on tiptoe in the dim moonshine in the direction of the noise, feeling as he went for one of the switches. His fingers touched the metal knob at last. He turned on the electric light. About 10 yards in front of him, crawling along the floor, was a man's hand. Eustace stared at it in utter amazement. It was moving quickly in the manner of a geometer caterpillar. The fingers humped up one moment, flattened out the next. The thumb appeared to give a crab-like motion to the whole. While he was looking, too surprised to stir, the hand disappeared round the corner. Eustace ran forward. He no longer saw it, but he could hear it, as it squeezed its way behind the books on one of the shelves. A heavy volume had been displaced. There was a gap in the row of books where it had got in. In his fear lest it should escape him again, he seized the first book that came to his hand and plugged it into the hole. Then, emptying 2 shelves of their contents, he took the wooden boards and propped them up in front to make his barrier double sure. "I wish Saunders was back," he said. "One can't tackle this sort of thing alone." It was after 11, and there seemed little likelihood of Saunders returning before 12. He did not dare to leave the shelf unwatched, even to run downstairs to ring the bell. Morton, the butler, often used to come round about 11 to see that the windows were fastened, but he might not come. Eustace was thoroughly unstrung. At last he heard steps down below. "Morton!" he shouted. "Morton!" "Sir?" "Has Mr. Saunders got back yet?" "Not yet, sir." "Well, bring me some brandy and hurry up about it. I'm up in the gallery, you duffer." Thanks," said Eustace, as he emptied the glass. "Don't go to bed yet, Morton. There are a lot of books that have fallen down by accident. Bring them up and put them back in their shelves." Morton had never seen Borlsover in so talkative a mood as on that night. "Here," said Eustace, when the books had been put back and dusted. You might hold up these boards for me, Morton. That beast in the box got out, and I've been chasing it all over the place. I think I can hear it chawing at the books, sir. They're not valuable, I hope." "Oh, I think that's a carriage, sir. I'll go and call Mr. Saunders." It seemed to Eustace that he was away for 5 minutes, but it could hardly have been more than 1 when he returned with Saunders. "All right, Morton, you can go now. I'm up here, Saunders." "What's all this row?" asked Saunders, as he lounged forward with his hands in his pockets. The luck had been with him all the evening. He was completely satisfied, both with himself and with Captain Lockwood's taste in wines. "What's the matter? You look to me to be in an absolutely blue funk." "That old devil of an uncle of mine," began Eustace. "I can't explain it all. It's his hand that's been playing old Harry all the evening, but I've got it cornered behind these books. You've got to help me catch it." "What's up with you, Eustace? What's the game?" "It's no game, you silly idiot. If you don't believe me, take out one of those books and put your hand in and feel it." "All right," said Saunders, "but wait till I've rolled up my sleeve. The accumulated dust of centuries, eh?" He took off coat, knelt down, and thrust his arm along the shelf. "There's something there right enough," he said. "It's got a funny stumpy end to it, whatever it is, and nips like a crab." "Ah, no, you don't." He pulled his hand out in a flash. "Shove in a book quickly, now it can't get out." "What was it?" asked Eustace. "Something that wanted very much to get a hold of me. I felt what seemed to be a thumb and a forefinger. Give me some brandy." "How are we to get it out of there?" "What about a landing net? No good. It would be too smart for us. I tell you, Saunders, it can cover the ground far faster than I can walk. But I think I see how we can manage it. The 2 books at the ends of the shelf are big ones that go right back against the wall. The others are very thin. I'll take out one at a time, and you slide the rest along until we have squashed it between the end too." It certainly seemed to be the best plan. One by one, as they took out the books, the space behind grew smaller and smaller. There was something in it that was certainly very much alive. Once they caught sight of fingers feeling for a way of escape. At last they had it pressed between the 2 big books. "There's muscle there, if there isn't warm flesh and blood," said Saunders, as he held them together. "It seems to be a hand right enough, too. I suppose this is a sort of infectious hallucination? I've read about such cases before." "Infectious fiddlesticks," said Eustace, his face white with anger. "Bring the thing downstairs. We'll get it back in the box." It was not altogether easy, but they were successful at last. "Drive in the screws," said Eustace. "We won't run any risks. Put the box in this old desk of mine. There's nothing in it that I want. Here's the key. Thank goodness that there's nothing wrong with the lock." "Quite a lively evening," said Saunders. "Now, let's hear more about your uncle." They sat up together until early morning. Saunders had no desire for sleep. Eustace was trying to explain and to forget, to conceal from himself a fear that he had never felt before, the fear of walking alone down the long corridor to his bedroom. "Whatever it was," said Eustace to Saunders on the following morning, "I propose that we drop the subject. There's nothing to keep us here for the next 10 days. We'll motor up to the lakes and get some climbing. See nobody all day and sit bored to death with each other every night. No, for me, thanks. Why not run up into town? Run's the exact word in this case, isn't it? We're both in such a blessed funk. Pull yourself together, Eustace, and let's have another look at the hand." "As you like," said Eustace. "There's the key." They went into the library and opened the desk. The box was as they had left it on the previous night. "What are you waiting for?" asked Eustace. "I'm waiting for you to volunteer to open the lid. However, since you seem to funk it, allow me. There doesn't seem to be the likelihood of any rumpus this morning, at all events." He opened the lid and picked out the hand. "Cold?" asked Eustace. "Tepid, a bit below blood heat by the feel. Soft and supple, too. If it's the embalming, it's a sort of embalming I've never seen before. Is it your uncle's hand?" "Oh, yes, it is all right," said Eustace. "I should know those long, thin fingers anywhere. Put it back in the box, Saunders. Never mind about the screws. I'll lock the desk so that there'll be no chance of its getting out. We'll compromise by motoring up to town for a week. If we can get off soon after lunch, we ought to be at Grantham or Stamford by night." "Right," said Saunders. "And tomorrow, well, by tomorrow we shall have forgotten all about this beastly thing." If, when the morrow came, they had not forgotten, it was certainly true that at the end of the week they were able to tell a very vivid ghost story at the little supper Eustace gave on Halloween. "You don't want us to believe it's true, Mr. Borlsover? How perfectly awful!" "I'll take my oath on it, and so would Saunders here, wouldn't you, old chap?" "Any number of oaths," said Saunders. "It was a long, thin hand, you know, and it gripped me just like that." "Don't, Mr. Saunders, don't! How perfectly horrid! Now tell us another one, do, only a really creepy one, please." "Here's a pretty mess," said Eustace on the following day, as he threw a letter across the table to Saunders. "It's your affair, though. Mrs. Merritt, if I understand it, gives a month's notice." "Oh, that's quite absurd on Mrs. Merritt's part," replied Saunders. "She doesn't know what she's talking about. Let's see what she says." "Dear Sir," he read. "This is to let you know that I must give you a month's notice as from Tuesday the 13th. For a long time I felt the place too big for me, but when Jane Parfitt and Emma Laidlaw go off with scarcely as much as 'if you please,' after frightening the wits out of the other girls so that they can't turn out a room by themselves, or walk alone down the stairs for fear of treading on half-frozen toads, or hearing it run along the passages at night, all I can say is that this is no place for me. So I must ask you, Mr. Borlsover, sir, to find a new housekeeper that has no objection to large and lonely houses, which some people do say, not that I believe them for a minute, my poor mother always having been a Wesleyan, are haunted. Yours faithfully, Elizabeth Merritt. P.S. I should be obliged if you would give my respects to Mr. Saunders. I hope that he won't run any risks with his cold." "Saunders," said Eustace, "you've always had a wonderful way with you in dealing with servants. You mustn't let poor old Merritt go." "Of course she shan't go," said Saunders. "She's probably only angling for a rise in salary. I'll write to her this morning." "No, there's nothing like a personal interview. We've had enough of town. We'll go back tomorrow, and you must work your cold for all it's worth. Don't forget that it's got on to the chest and will require weeks of feeding up and nursing." "All right, I think I can manage, Mrs. Merritt." But Mrs. Merritt was more obstinate than he had thought. She was very sorry to hear of Mr. Saunders' cold, and how he lay awake all night in London coughing. Very sorry indeed. She'd change his room for him gladly and get the south room aired, and wouldn't he have a hot basin of bread and milk last thing at night? But she was afraid that she would have to leave at the end of the month. Try her with an increase of salary, was the advice of Eustace. It was no use. Mrs. Merritt was obdurate, though she knew of a Mrs. Goddard, who had been a housekeeper to Lord Gargrave, who might be glad to come at the salary mentioned. "What's the matter with the servants, Morton?" asked Eustace that evening, when he brought the coffee into the library. "What's all this about Mrs. Merritt wanting to leave?" "If you please, sir, I was going to mention it myself. I have a confession to make, sir. When I found your note asking me to open that desk and take out the box with the rat, I broke the lock, as you told me, and was glad to do it because I could hear the animal in the box making a great noise, and I thought it wanted food. So I took out the box, sir, and got a cage, and was going to transfer it when the animal got away." "What in the world are you talking about? I never wrote any such note." "Excuse me, sir. It was the note I picked up here on the floor on the day you and Mr. Saunders left. I have it in my pocket now." It certainly seemed to be in Eustace's handwriting. It was written in pencil and began somewhat abruptly. "Get a hammer, Morton," he read, "or some other tool, and break open the lock in the old desk in the library. Take out the box that is inside. You need not do anything else. The lid is already open. Eustace Borlsover." "And you opened the desk?" "Yes, sir. And as I was getting the cage ready, the animal hopped out." "What animal?" "The animal inside the box, sir." "What did it look like?" "Well, sir, I couldn't tell you," said Morton nervously. "My back was turned, and it was halfway down the room when I looked up." "What was its colour?" asked Saunders. "Black?" "Oh, no, sir, greyish-white. It crept along in a very funny way, sir. I don't think it had a tail." "What did you do then?" "I tried to catch it, but it was no use, so I set the rat traps and kept the library shut. Then that girl, Emma Laidlaw, left the door open when she was cleaning, and I think it must have escaped." "And you think it is the animal that's been frightening the maids?" "Well, no, sir, not quite. They said it was, you'll excuse me, sir, a hand that they saw. Emma trod on it once at the bottom of the stairs. She thought that it was a half-frozen toad, only white. And then Parfitt was washing up the dishes in the scullery. She wasn't thinking about anything in particular. It was close on dusk. She took her hands out of the water and was drying them absent-minded-like on the roller towel, when she found she was drying someone else's hand as well, only colder than hers." "What nonsense!" exclaimed Saunders. "Exactly, sir. That's what I told her, but we couldn't get her to stop." "You don't believe all this?" said Eustace, turning suddenly towards the butler. "Me, sir? Oh, no, sir. I've not seen anything." "Nor heard anything?" "Well, sir, if you must know, The bells do ring at odd times, and there's nobody there when we go. And when we go round to draw the blinds at night, as often as not somebody's been there before us. But as I says to Mrs. Merritt, a young monkey might do wonderful things, and we all know that Mr. Borlsover has had some strange animals about the place. Very well, Morton, that will do. What do you make of it? Asked Saunders when they were alone. I mean, of the letter he said you wrote. Oh, that's simple enough, said Eustace. See the paper it's written on. I stopped using that paper years ago, but there were a few odd sheets and envelopes left in the old desk. We never fastened up the lid of the box before locking it in. The hand got out, found a pencil, wrote this note, and shoved it through the crack onto the floor, where Morton found it. That's plain as daylight. But the hand couldn't write, couldn't it? You've not seen it do the things I've seen. And he told Saunders more of what had happened at Eastbourne. Well, said Saunders, in that case we have at least an explanation of the legacy. It was the hand which wrote, unknown to your uncle, that letter to your solicitor bequeathing itself to you. Your uncle had no more to do with that request than I. In fact, it would seem that he had some idea of this automatic writing and feared it. Then, if it's not my uncle, what is it? I suppose some people might say that a disembodied spirit had got your uncle to educate and prepare a little body for it. Now it's got into that little body and is off on its own. Well, what are we to do? We'll keep our eyes open, said Saunders, and try to catch it. If we can't do that, we shall have to wait till the bally clockwork runs down. After all, if it's flesh and blood, it can't live forever. For 2 days, nothing happened. Then Saunders saw it sliding down the banister in the hall. He was taken unawares and lost a full second before he started in pursuit, only to find that the thing had escaped him. 3 days later, Eustace, writing alone in the library at night, saw it sitting on an open book at the other end of the room. The fingers crept over the page as if it were reading, but before he had time to get up from his seat, it had taken the alarm and was pulling itself up the curtains. Eustace watched it grimly as it hung onto the cornice with 3 fingers and flicked thumb and forefinger at him in an expression of scornful derision. I know what I'll do, he said. If I only get it into the open, I'll set the dogs onto it. He spoke to Saunders of the suggestion. It's a jolly good idea, he said, only we won't wait till we find it out of doors. We'll get the dogs. There are the 2 terriers and the underkeeper's Irish mongrel that's onto rats like a flash. Your spaniel's not got spirit enough for this sort of game. They brought the dogs into the house, and the keeper's Irish mongrel chewed up the slippers, and the terriers tripped up Morton as he waited at table, but all 3 were welcome. Even false security is better than no security at all. For a fortnight, nothing happened. Then the hand was caught, not by the dogs, but by Mrs. Merritt's grey parrot. The bird was in the habit of periodically removing the pins that kept its seed and water tins in place, and of escaping through the holes in the side of the cage. When once at liberty, Peter would show no inclination to return, and would often be about the house for days. Now, after 6 consecutive weeks of captivity, Peter had again discovered a new way of unloosing his bolts, and was at large, exploring the tapestried forests of the curtains, and singing songs in praise of liberty from cornice and picture rail. It's no use your trying to catch him, said Eustace to Mrs. Merritt as she came into the study one afternoon towards dusk with a step-ladder. You'd much better leave Peter alone. Starve him into surrender, Mrs. Merritt, and don't leave bananas and seed about for him to peck at when he fancies he's hungry. You're far too soft-hearted. Well, sir, I see he's right out of reach now on that picture rail. So, if you wouldn't mind closing the door, sir, when you leave the room, I'll bring his cage in tonight and put some meat inside it. He's that fond of meat, though it does make him pull out his feathers to suck the quills. They do say that if you cook— Never mind, Mrs. Merritt, said Eustace, who was busy writing. That'll do. I'll keep an eye on the bird. For a short time there was silence in the room. Scratch poor Peter, said the bird. Scratch poor Peter. Be quiet, you beastly bird. Poor old Peter. Scratch poor Peter, do. I'm more likely to wring your neck if I get hold of you. He looked up at the picture rail, and there was the hand, holding on to a hook with 3 fingers, and slowly scratching the head of the parrot with the 4th. Eustace ran to the bell and pressed it hard, then across to the window, which he closed with a bang. Frightened by the noise, the parrot shook its wings preparatory to flight, and as it did so, the fingers of the hand got hold of it by the throat. There was a shrill scream from Peter as he fluttered across the room, wheeling round in circles that ever descended, borne down under the weight that clung to him. The bird dropped at last quite suddenly, and Eustace saw fingers and feathers rolled into an inextricable mass on the floor. The struggle abruptly ceased as finger and thumb squeezed the neck. The bird's eyes rolled up to show the whites, and there was a faint, half-choked gurgle. But before the fingers had time to loose their hold, Eustace had them in his own. "Send Mr. Saunders here at once," he said to the maid who came in answer to the bell. "Tell him I want him immediately." Then he went with the hand to the fire. There was a ragged gash across the back where the bird's beak had torn it, but no blood oozed from the wound. He noted with disgust that the nails had grown long and discoloured. "I'll burn the beastly thing," he said, but he could not burn it. He tried to throw it into the flames, but his own hands, as if impelled by some old primitive feeling, would not let him. And so Saunders found him, pale and irresolute, with the hand still clasped tightly in his fingers. "I've got it at last," he said in a tone of triumph. "Good, let's have a look at it. Not when it's loose. Get me some nails and a hammer and a board of some sort. Can you hold it all right?" Yes, the thing's quite limp. Tired out with throttling poor old Peter, I should say." "And now," said Saunders, when he returned with the things, "what are we going to do?" "Drive a nail through it first so it can't get away. Then we can take our time over examining it." "Do it yourself," said Saunders. "I don't mind helping you with guinea pigs occasionally, when there's something to be learned, partly because I don't fear a guinea pig's revenge. This thing's different." "Oh, my aunt!" he giggled hysterically. "Look at it now!" For the hand was writhing in agonized contortions, squirming and wriggling upon the nail like a worm upon the hook. "Well," said Saunders, "you've done it now. I'll leave you to examine it." "Don't go! In heaven's name! Cover it up, man! Cover it up! Shove a cloth over it!" And he pulled off the antimacassar from the back of a chair and wrapped the board in it. "Now get the keys from my pocket and open the safe. Chuck the other things out. Oh, Lord, it's getting itself into frightful knots. Open it quick!" He threw the thing in and banged the door. "We'll keep it there till it dies," he said. "May I burn in hell if I ever open the door of that safe again." Mrs. Merritt departed at the end of the month. Her successor, Mrs. Handyside, certainly was more successful in the management of the servants. Early in her rule she declared that she would stand no nonsense, and gossip soon withered and died. "I shouldn't be surprised if Eustace married one of these days," said Saunders. "Well, I'm in no hurry for such an event. I know him far too well for the future Mr. Borlsover to like me. It will be the same old story again. A long friendship slowly made, marriage, and a long friendship quickly forgotten." But Eustace did not follow the advice of his uncle and marry. Old habits crept over and covered his new experience. He was, if anything, less morose, and showed a great inclination to take his natural part in country society. Then came the burglary. The men, it was said, broke into the house by way of the conservatory. It was really little more than an attempt, for they only succeeded in carrying away a few pieces of plate from the pantry. The safe in the study was certainly found open and empty, but as Mr. Borlsover informed the police inspector, he had kept nothing of value in it during the last 6 months. "Then you're lucky in getting off so easily, sir," the man replied. "By the way they have gone about their business, I should say they were experienced cracksmen. They must have caught the alarm when they were just beginning their evening's work." "Yes," said Eustace, I suppose I am lucky." "I've no doubt," said the inspector, "that we shall be able to trace the men. I've said that they must have been old hands at the game. The way they got in and opened the safe shows that, but there's one little thing that puzzles me. One of them was careless enough not to wear gloves, and I'm bothered if I know what he was trying to do. I've traced his finger marks on the new varnish on the window sashes in every one of the downstairs room. They're very distinctive ones, too." "Right hand or left or both?" asked Eustace. "Oh, right every time. That's a funny thing. He must have been a foolhardy fellow, and I rather think it was him that wrote that." He took out a slip of paper from his pocket. "That's what he wrote, sir. 'I've got out, Eustace Borlsover, but I'll be back before long. Some jailbird must have escaped, I suppose. It'll make it all the easier for us to trace him. Do you know the writing, sir?" "No," said Eustace. "It's not the writing of anyone I know." "I'm not going to stay here any longer," said Eustace to Saunders at luncheon. "I've got on far better during the last 6 months than I expected, but I'm not going to run the risk of seeing that thing again. I shall go up to town this afternoon, get Morton to put my things together and join me with the car at Brighton on the day after tomorrow, and bring the proofs of those 2 papers with you. We'll run over them together." "How long are you going to be away?" "I can't say for certain, but be prepared to stay for some time. We've stuck to work pretty closely through the summer, and I, for one, need a holiday. I'll engage the rooms at Brighton. You'll find it best to break the journey at Hitchin. I'll wire to you there at the Crown to tell you the Brighton address." The house he chose at Brighton was in a terrace. He had been there before. It was kept by his old college gyp, a man of discreet silence, who was admirably partnered by an excellent cook. The rooms were on the first floor. The 2 bedrooms were at the back and opened out of each other. "Mr. Saunders can have the smaller one, though it is the only one with a fireplace," he said. "I'll stick to the larger of the 2, since it's got a bathroom adjoining. I wonder what time he'll arrive with the car." Saunders came about 7, cross and cold and dirty. "We'll light the fire in the dining room," said Eustace, "and get Prince to unpack some of the things while we're at dinner. What were the roads like?" "Rotten, swimming with mud, and a beastly cold wind against us all the day. And this is July! Dear old England." "Yes," said Eustace. "I think we might do worse than leave old England for a couple of months." They turned in soon after 12. "You oughtn't to feel cold, Saunders," said Eustace, "when you can afford to sport a great fur-lined coat like this. You do yourself very well, all things considered. Look at those gloves, for instance. Who could possibly feel cold when wearing them? They're far too clumsy, though, for driving. Try 'em on and see." And he tossed them through the door onto Eustace's bed and went on with his unpacking. A minute later he heard a shrill cry of terror. "Oh, Lord!" he heard. "It's in the glove! Quick, Saunders, quick!" Then came a smacking thud. Eustace had thrown it from him. "I've chucked it into the bathroom," he gasped. "It's hit the wall and fallen into the bath. Come now if you want to help." Saunders, with a lighted candle in his hand, looked over the edge of the bath. There it was, old and maimed, dumb and blind, with a ragged hole in the middle, crawling, staggering, trying to creep up the slippery sides, only to fall back, helpless. "Stay there," said Saunders. "I'll empty a collar box or something, and we'll jam it in. It can't get out while I'm away." "Yes, it can," shouted Eustace. "It's getting out now. It's climbing up the plug chain." "No, you brute, you filthy brute, you don't!" "Come back, Saunders. It's getting away from me. I can't hold it. It's all slippery. Curse its claws. Shut the window, you idiot. It's got out." There was the sound of something dropping onto the hard flagstones below, and Eustace fell back, fainting. For a fortnight he was ill. "I don't know what to make of it," the doctor said to Saunders. "I can only suppose that Mr. Borlsover has suffered some great emotional shock. You had better let me send someone to help you nurse him, and by all means indulge that whim of his never to be left alone in the dark. I would keep a light burning all night if I were you, but he must have more fresh air. It's perfectly absurd, this hatred of open windows." Eustace would have no one with him but Saunders. "I don't want the other man," he said. "They'd smuggle it in somehow, I know they would." "Don't worry about it, old chap. This sort of thing can't go on indefinitely. You know I saw it this time as well as you. It wasn't half so active. It won't go on living much longer, especially after that fall. I heard it hit the flags myself. As soon as you're a bit stronger, we'll leave this place, not bag and baggage, but with only the clothes on our backs, so it won't be able to hide anywhere. We'll escape it that way. We won't give any address, and we won't have any parcels sent after us. Cheer up, Eustace. You'll be well enough to leave in a day or 2. The doctor says I can take you out in a chair tomorrow." What have I done?" asked Eustace. "Why does it come after me? I'm no worse than other men. I'm no worse than you, Saunders. You know I'm not. It was you who was at the bottom of that dirty business in San Diego, and that was 15 years ago." "It's not that, of course," said Saunders. "We're in the 20th century, and even the parsons have dropped the idea of your old sins finding you out. Before you caught the hand in the library, it was filled with pure malevolence to you and all mankind. After you spiked it through with that nail, it naturally forgot about other people and concentrated its attention on you. It was shut up in that safe, you know, for nearly 6 months. That gives you plenty of time for thinking of revenge. Eustace Borlsover would not leave his room, but he thought there must be something in Saunders' suggestion of a sudden departure from Brighton. He began rapidly to regain his strength. "We'll go on the 1st of September," he said. The evening of the 31st of August was oppressively warm. Though at midday the windows had been wide open, they had been shut an hour or so before dusk. Mrs. Prince had long since ceased to wonder at the strange habits of the gentlemen on the first floor. Soon after their arrival, she had been told to take down the heavy curtains in the 2 bedrooms, and day by day the rooms had seemed to grow more bare. Nothing was left lying about. "Mr. Borlsover doesn't like to have any place where dirt can collect," Saunders had said as an excuse. "He likes to see into all the corners of the room. Couldn't I open the window just a little?" he said to Eustace that evening. We're simply roasting in here, you know." "No, leave well alone. We're not a couple of boarding school misses fresh down from a course in hygiene lectures. Get the chessboard out." They sat down and played. At 10 o'clock, Mrs. Prince came to the door with a note. I'm sorry I didn't bring it before," she said, "but it was left in the letterbox. Open it, Saunders, and see if it wants answering." It was very brief. There was neither address nor signature. "Will 11 o'clock tonight be suitable for our last appointment?" Who's it from?" asked Borlsover. "It was meant for me," said Saunders. "There's no answer, Mrs. Prince." And he put the paper into his pocket. "A dunning letter from a tailor, I suppose. He must have got wind of our leaving." It was a clever lie, and Eustace asked no more questions. They went on with their game. On the landing outside, Saunders could hear the grandfather's clock whispering the seconds, blurting out the quarter hours. "Check," said Eustace. The clock struck 11. At the same time, there was a gentle knocking on the door. It seemed to come from the bottom panel. "Who's there?" asked Eustace. There was no answer. "Mrs. Prince, is that you?" "She's up above," said Saunders. "I can hear her walking about the room." "Then lock the door, bolt it too. Your move, Saunders." While Saunders sat with his eyes on the chessboard, Eustace walked over to the window and examined the fastenings. He did the same in Saunders' room, the bathroom. There were no doors between the 3 rooms, or he would have shut and locked them too. "Now, Saunders," he said, "don't stay all night over your move. I've had time to smoke 1 cigarette already. It's bad to keep an invalid waiting. There's only one possible thing for you to do now." "What was that?" "The ivy blowing against the window. There, it's your move now, Eustace." "It wasn't the ivy, you idiot. It was someone tapping at the window." And he pulled up the blind. On the outer side of the window, clinging to the sash, was the hand. "What's that it's holding?" It's a pocket knife. It's going to try to open the window by pushing back the fastener with the blade." "Well, let it try," said Eustace. "Those fasteners screw down. They can't be opened that way. Anyhow, we'll close the shutters. It's your move, Saunders. I've played." But Saunders found it impossible to fix his attention on the game. He could not understand Eustace, who seemed all at once to have lost his fear. "What do you say to some wine?" he asked. "You seem to be taking things coolly, but I don't mind confessing that I'm in a blessed funk." "You've no need to be. There's nothing supernatural about that hand. Saunders, I mean, it seems to be governed by the laws of time and space. It's not the sort of thing that vanishes into thin air or slides through oaken doors. And since that's so, I defy it to get in here. We'll leave the place in the morning. I, for one, have bottomed the depths of fear. Fill your glass, man. The windows are all shuttered. The door is locked and bolted. Pledge me my Uncle Adrian. Drink, man. What are you waiting for?" Saunders was standing with his glass half raised. "It can get in," he said hoarsely. "It can get in. We've forgotten. There's a fireplace in my bedroom. It'll come down the chimney." "Quick!" said Eustace, as he rushed into the other room. "We haven't a minute to lose. What can we do? Light the fire, Saunders. Give me a match, quick." They must all be in the other room. I'll get them. Hurry, man, for goodness sake. Look, in the bookcase. Look in the bathroom. Here, come and stand here. I'll look." "Be quick," shouted Saunders. "I can hear something." "Then plug a sheet from your bed up the chimney." "No, here's a match." He had found one at last that had slipped into the crack in the floor. "Is the fire laid? Good, but it may not burn, I know. The oil from that old reading lamp, and this cotton wool. Now, the match, quick! Pull the sheet away, you fool! We don't want it now!" There was a great roar from the grate as the flames shot up. Saunders had been a fraction of a second too late with the sheet. The oil had fallen onto it. It, too, was burning. "The whole place will be on fire!" cried Eustace as he tried to beat out the flames with a blanket. "It's no good, I can't manage it. You must open the door, Saunders, and get help." Saunders ran to the door and fumbled with the bolts. The key was stiff in the lock. "Hurry!" shouted Eustace, "or the heat will be too much for me." The key turned in the lock at last. For half a second Saunders stopped to look back. Afterwards, he could never be quite sure as to what he had seen, but at the time he thought that something black and charred was creeping slowly, very slowly, from the mass of flames towards Eustace Borlsover. For a moment he thought of returning to his friend, but the noise and the smell of the burning sent him running down the passage, crying, "Fire! Fire!" He rushed to the telephone to summon help, and then back into the bathroom. He should have thought of that before. For water. As he burst into the bedroom, there came a scream of terror, which ended suddenly, and then the sound of a heavy fall. This is the story which I heard on successive Saturday evenings from the senior mathematical master at a second-rate suburban school. For Saunders has had to earn a living in a way which other men might reckon less congenial than his old manner of life. I had mentioned by chance the name of Adrian Borlsover, and wondered at the time why he changed the conversation with such unusual abruptness. A week later, Saunders began to tell me something of his own history, sordid enough, though shielded with a reserve I could well understand. For it had to cover not only his failings, but those of a dead friend. Of the final tragedy he was at first especially loath to speak, and it was only gradually that I was able to piece together the narrative of the preceding pages. Saunders was reluctant to draw any conclusions. At one time he thought that the fingered beast had been animated by the spirit of Sigismund Borlsover, a sinister 18th century ancestor, who, according to legend, built and worshipped in the ugly pagan temple that overlooked the lake. At another time Saunders believed the spirit to belong to a man whom Eustace had once employed as a laboratory assistant, a black-haired, spiteful little brute, he said, who died cursing his doctor because the fellow couldn't help him live to settle some paltry score with Borlsover. From the point of view of direct contemporary evidence, Saunders' story is practically uncorroborated. All the letters mentioned in the narrative were destroyed, with the exception of the last note which Eustace received, or rather which he would have received had not Saunders intercepted it. That I have seen myself. The handwriting was thin and shaky, the handwriting of an old man. I remembered the Greek E was used in appointment. A little thing that amused me at the time was that Saunders seemed to keep the note pressed between the pages of his Bible. I had seen Adrian Borlsover once. Saunders I learned to know well. It was by chance, however, and not by design, that I met a third person of the story, Morton, the butler. Saunders and I were walking in the zoological gardens one Sunday afternoon when he called my attention to an old man who was standing before the door of the reptile house. "Why, Morton," he said, clapping him on the back, "how is the world treating you?" "Poorly, Mr. Saunders," said the old fellow, though his face lighted up at the greeting. "The winters drag terribly nowadays. There don't seem to be no summers or springs. You haven't found what you were looking for, I suppose?" "No, sir, not yet, but I shall some day. I always told them that Mr. Borlsover kept some queer animals." "And what is he looking for?" I asked, when we had parted from him. "A beast with 5 fingers," said Saunders. "This afternoon, since he has been in the reptile house, I suppose it will be a reptile with a hand. Next week it will be a monkey with practically no body. The poor old chap is a born materialist."
Everybody dies, don't they?
You might be one of those people like me who doesn't like the stories to be interrupted with ads. And this podcast has ads on it. However, there is a solution. If you would like access to the stories without ads and a link to a library of all the stories I've ever done that you can download without ads, you can get that by becoming a patron. So if you join for $5 or the equivalent in your currency a month, you can have all the stories ad-free. So consider becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/Barcud, BARCUD.
So that was The Beast with Five Fingers by W.F. Harvey. You may know it better as the, I think, 1946 film with Peter Lorre. Yeah, The Beast with Five Fingers. The story is different. It's about a pianist, isn't it? In the black and white movie. But that's how I first came across the story. I'll tell you a bit about W.F. Harvey. So William Fryer Harvey. We've done at least one of his stories before. August Heat, which you'll find on the podcast. A short story, that one. And sort of not horrific, but a bit unsettling. This was at times grotesque. And one of my... let me tell you about Harvey first. So he was born in 1885 in Leeds in West Yorkshire, and he was born into a rich Quaker family. If you know what Quakers are, they're a kind of Protestant sect that's known for quite unorthodox and radical, for the time, views, where they sit in silence until they're moved to speak by the Holy Spirit. Traditionally pacifist. Traditionally, they do a lot of. They've got a big social conscience, and a lot of the factories, usually very successful in business. I mean, obviously not every Quaker, and they have a reputation and a history of treating their workers really nicely and giving them fantastic conditions to work in. So Quakers, a bit more to it than that, but that's what do you know about Quakers, Tony? There's a Quaker meeting house in most towns, and I think a lot of the Quakers went across to the US with the other Protestant sects, although they are slightly different. I think they're more mystical in a sense, whereby if we differentiate between mystical and religious views, religious, is about the external trappings, the liturgy, the building, the words, the book, the form of the service, the actual beliefs that you will have, whereas mystics tend to look for confirmation from God from the inside, if you like, and Quakers tend to fall into that. I've got both dogs. I've got two of my three dogs up here at the moment, and it's weather's slightly warming, so the flies around, and they go nuts chasing flies. So if you hear the sound of something being knocked over or snapping jaws, it's because they've seen a fly. I'm not going to ban them. They can stay in here. So anyway, going back to W.F. Harvey was a Quaker family and rich, really. He had an inheritance on his father's side, and his parents therefore were allowed to, because of the money, devote themselves to charitable causes in accordance with their faith, as we've pointed out. I think it was his uncle, Thomas Edmund Harvey, was Member of Parliament. He went to Leeds and he trained in medicine, and he went to the University of Leeds and later pursued medical training at Balliol College, Oxford, where a lot of politicians go to Balliol College. During the First World War, he served as a sergeant lieutenant in the Royal Navy. His distinguished service included a heroic act of life-saving, rescuing an engineer from a flooded engine room, an act for which he was awarded the Albert Medal for life-saving, one of the highest civilian honours for bravery. However, this caused him severe lung damage, and the effects of this injury compromised his health and his career. And he couldn't really continue as a doctor, so he became a writer. And he published several collections of short stories, including Midnight House and Other Tales 1910 and The Beast with Five Fingers in 1928. This was originally published. I'll tell you about the publication of this story and we'll get to it, but in between those collections, The Beast with Five Fingers, as we said, was made into a 1946 film. It's very interesting because of his lifelong faith as a Quaker, and they were pacifists, so very often Quakers would serve in the medical, if they were drafted or called up, they would serve in the medical areas of the armed forces, like he did, of course. So yeah, Quaker emphasis on pacifism, inner peace and social justice. And you would think that, well, what's this guy with those outward tenets doing writing horror stories? Well, I've said it before and I've said it again. All of us are complete creatures. We contain both light and dark, and we can either acknowledge our greyness, which is a combination of both the good bits of us and the bad bits of us. I'm not saying he was like this, but very often the dark has to come out somewhere. The bad in us has to come out somewhere, or the things that are macabre and dark. I just think that's true, and they came out in his stories, and that allowed him to be a nice person in the rest of his life. So yeah, you may say, that may be something that occurred to you. So this story, his medical training, he knows about anatomy, doesn't he? It's not gone into great detail with anatomical terms in the story, but he clearly knows about, and he's seen plenty of severed hands, I would imagine, in his time, unlike most of us. So perhaps, when he was describing a severed hand, he'd seen a few, maybe none on the Peter Lorre film playing the piano, or in this one climbing up the curtains and strangling poor old Peter the parrot. Maybe people will contact me, parrot lovers. I'm a lover of parrots. I didn't write the story, I just read it. So and Peter didn't really exist, so don't get too upset about Peter's demise. Or the demise of the hand, although I suspect most people don't give a monkey's about whether the hand gets burned. It's Peter we're worried about. Maybe we're worried about Peter more than Eustace Borlsover. So anyway, he spent his later years in Letchworth in Hertfordshire, and he continued to write despite recurring illness, and he died in 1937 at the relatively young age of 52, and he's buried at the churchyard of St Mary the Virgin in Old Letchworth. He wasn't massively prolific, but he led I think his stories are interesting. I think there's a lot to say about this story. So this story, the publication history, The Beast with Five Fingers, it was first published in 1919 in an anthology called The New Decameron, Volume the First. And then he later republished it in his own collection, The Beast with Five Fingers and Other Stories, which came out in 1928. What was the New Decameron? That's interesting in itself. It was a multi-volume anthology series published in the years following the First World War, beginning in 1919. So obviously he's in the first of it. So the Decameron, the original Decameron, is an Italian collection of stories dating from the 14th century, written by Giovanni Boccaccio, and it tells the stories of, it's 100 tales by a group of people, young people sheltering from the Black Death. So they left the cities, and my dad had a copy of the Decameron. I never read it. I can see the cover, but I looked at it, but I never got around to reading it. Hang on a second, there's something going on in Dog World behind me. What's going on? What are you doing? You're under the bed? What are you doing under the bed? Oh, who knows? I have no idea what they're doing under the bed. Callie, what were you doing under the bed? Anyway, never mind, let's get back to this. So this idea of the New Decameron was to offer a varied and engaging series of modern tales, essays and reflections, bringing together contemporary writers from the early 20th century, and he had the great honour of being in the first volume. Eventually there were 6 volumes published between 1919 and 1929, and the interesting thing is that each book dealt with a single day of a tour, as we would say, of the various men and women on the tour tell their stories as a way to pass the time. So the editor was Wilfrid Blair, who was probably Wallace Wilfrid Blair Fish. He was a journalist, part-time author and playwright. There's a framing story, okay? So the Decameron had a framing story that sets it up, and Blair Fish may have written that. It was published by the Medici Society. So let's say about this story. So this has a framing story as well. I wasn't completely sure. There's the old Mr. Borlsover, and we told this story of the Borlsovers being eccentric gentleman scientists, as Darwin was, and you may disagree that he was I think he was a gentleman, to be honest, in the strict terms of his time, and although he went to sea and collected those things as part of he was a scientist, and I suppose he was a professional scientist. I think I'm tangling myself up here a bit, but you know what I mean. So the tradition of enthusiastic and knowledgeable amateur scientists expanding the knowledge of humanity is it would have been very familiar to readers. And so we have this story of this unknown narrator who tells us how he came across this tale, and he first of all meets Uncle Adrian. I had an Uncle Adrian, and who is blind, which seems significant, but I'm not sure why. So Uncle Adrian is eminent, he goes blind, and he learns to tell things like the colour of a ribbon just by the touch. So his sense of touch becomes extremely extended, and perhaps this is why so much energy is given to the hand and the fingers that they take on a life of their own. I don't really understand that. And then, of course, perhaps he could have written a story where it was Eustace's own hand, but I suppose he'd then have to explain how it became severed. Although it could have been an accident. Maybe that would have been a different story, but the choices that Harvey made are the ones he made, and so I'm not struggling, but I'm wondering why Uncle Adrian appears at all. I don't think Uncle Adrian is necessary. I think you could have got round the story with fly hunting. There's 3 of them here now. Without Uncle Adrian, and the fact, but it seems significant that he's blind, and I think it is the only sense I can make of it is that it somehow this concentrates extreme sensitivity in the hand to the extent that it splits off. Very interesting. I don't know if you come across alien hand syndrome. There's a lot of writing on it now, but I came across it first in Oliver Sacks' books, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which talks about neurological accidents and the effect of brain injury to produce some quite startling descriptions of how people were, and really challenging to our understanding of what we are. For example, with alien hand syndrome, and of course a good example of this is Peter Sellers' Dr. Strangelove, where his hand does all sorts of things he doesn't want to do. So Oliver Sacks talks about people who, and who else did I read about this? Perhaps Ian McGilchrist, talking about how these hands have personalities of their own in the left hand and the right hand. And often somebody who's got alien hand syndrome will look at the hand that they don't feel is theirs anymore, that's operating independently, and they will say it's not theirs, and what's that doing there, or it's their mother's, or they come up with these. I don't know if you never worked with. I used to get this a lot with alcoholics. People would confabulate. So if you ask people who've got mental, usually organic brain problems, they report a bizarre occurrence or something that doesn't seem to make sense, they will confabulate. They'll make a story up which seems perfectly plausible to them, and they appear to actually believe it, even though looking at it, it's just beyond belief. It's somebody else is looking at it thinking, no, that can't be true, but they do this, and people with alien hand syndrome will confabulate all sorts of stories about that this isn't their hand, it's somebody else's hand. It might be your hand. I've never actually met a patient like this, I must say, but it's a documented neurological condition. In this case, of course, the hand goes a bit further. It's actually severed and self-animating, and seems to be able to live without food or drink. So it's a very interesting hand. What is the symbolism of the hand? Well, of course, it immediately reminded me of a story by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, The Ghost of a Hand, which I've done. That hand is a ghost hand. This is not a ghost hand. It's very corporeal. It's very real, and it has its own intelligence, like alien hand syndrome. If you don't know about alien hand syndrome, it's really interesting. You should go and read up on it. And if you look at, I'm trying to think of what is the symbolism. We look at severed hands. Trawling the internet, you find the legend of St Cuthbert, a 7th century saint of Northumbria, not very far from me. There's churches to Cuthbert all over the place around here. His hand, he was miraculously healed by touching the severed hand of St Oswald, a previous Northumbrian saint and king and martyr killed by Cadwallon of Gwynedd. And so it's a symbol of divine power and healing in that case. There's an Irish myth, there's an interesting Irish character called, probably a god or some kind, Nuother Arrogid Love. So Nuother of the silver hand. Now, he loses his hand in battle, and because for the old Irish kings you had to be physically whole, or you had to be unblemished, or you couldn't be a king, they Dian Cecht, who's the physician magician, makes him a functioning silver hand. So Arrogid law is hand, and Arrogid is the Irish word for silver. Now he then, it's the loss of power by losing his hand and the attempt to reclaim power through artificial means. This guy, Nuother, is probably related to the god known from Roman sources in Britain, maybe Gaul as well, as Nodens. Anyway, Nodens. And he has there's a place in Gloucestershire called Lydney, which was one of his temples. And he seemed to be particularly associated with greyhounds, but also he was a god of healing, and people would go to his temple. We know that from archaeology. He morphs into later medieval Welsh stories as Neith of Llaw Eraint, who's also known as Llydd Llaw Eraint because of the alliteration of the and same thing. Llaw is Welsh for hand, Lurf or Lurf in Cornish, and Love in Gaelic. Hope you're with me there. And Arrogid in Welsh is Arian, usually, older Eraint, Archant in Breton, Archants in Cornish. Anyway, so silver. So this silver hand, anyway, I've spent a lot of time on something that's got nothing at all to do with the story. And of course we have the Hand of Glory, which is a folklore object, and it's supposed to be the severed and pickled hand of a hanged man, can be mummified, and you burn candles on it. And when it was lit, the candles on it, I think you actually lit the fingers, it makes everybody sleep. So thieves prized it so they could get into a house and make everybody sleep. That's a hand of glory. So if you were hanged, somebody would come and cut your hand off and then sell it, whether they believed it worked or not, or whether they just saw, we'll sell it to some gullible thief. And then of course other things like, there's other stories. The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. We have a supernatural monkey's paw. I'm not sure that's completely equivalent. Telltale Heart, of course, is the separated heart by Edgar Allan Poe. I should say that, and I forgot to say, that W.F. Harvey was a big fan of Poe, and so this probably is what got him into writing grotesque stories. So that's the symbolism of the hand. Other things struck me about the story. The first thing is this. I'm going to use, you've already heard my dogs chasing flies, so obviously this is not a professional podcast. I'm going to tell you something. When I was about 17, I was in a band. 16, 17, I was a drummer, and we thought we were going to make it big, but we never did. And one of the lads there, the bass player, introduced me to cannabis. I only did it then, and I've taken CBD oil since, but obviously strictly illegal, don't tell anybody. And I didn't smoke. Story of why I don't smoke is my grandfather died of lung cancer, and when he was dying he shook my hand and he said, "Promise me, Tony, you'll never smoke." And I never did. That was a long time ago. But so I didn't smoke it, so what I would do would eat it, and I ate some and nothing happened, so I ate a big chunk, and so I was away with the fairies. I thought I was in a spaceship at one point, so I got him to walk me halfway up the hill. I went home and I sat down sweating and feeling the strangest, and guess what was on the TV? The Beast with Five Fingers. So here I am sitting with my mother and father watching The Beast with Five Fingers, the Peter Lorre version, and freaking out with it. And then many years later, I saw, and terrified. I thought it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. And then many years later, I watched it again. I thought, this is a comedy. This is a comedy. And I think one of the problems writing horror is you stretch people's credulity. Obviously, you're telling them stories about things that can't really happen. Well, most of us think they can't really happen. The danger is if you make it too far-fetched, people will just abandon it and go, no. And it becomes comic, So I'm not sure if Harvey was intending some of Eustace and Saunders' banter to be comic. I mean, they see this thing and they actually behave in a very pragmatic, practical way. We're going to pin it down. You tell you what, in the bookshelf, you jam it and we'll grab it, put your hand in there. What have you got? Oh, it's a dismembered hand wandering around. And they're not, you would probably freak out, wouldn't you? You'd probably leave the house and never go back again. It would upturn your idea of what can be. It would unseat your reason. I mean, at least Lovecraft makes you go crazy when you see things like this. But these guys are just taking it in their stride. Okay, they are a bit worried about it, but at the end, he's not worried about it. He just has a drink. I can't get in. It's fine. It's a a severed hand trying to get in your window. It's fine. Want to play chess? So I wondered whether it was intended to be comic. And of course, there are stories that mix the comic and the horrific. I always think of Twin Peaks in that. And I think some of my Ashridge stories, I've tried to do that as well, to go between lines that will make you laugh to very shortly afterwards making you frightened. And so I'm not sure if Harvey was doing that there in this story, but I wondered whether he was, because it was so obviously, he couldn't really be taking this seriously, Anyway, other things to talk about from the story are, what did Eustace do to be punished? So he's a natural scientist, a natural philosopher. He's going around the world. He's trying to work out things on heredity. And he's punished. This hand fixes on him. I think Saunders says at one point, the hand probably hated everybody. Then you put a big nail through its middle and it really, really hated you. And actually, that's a very pragmatic and practical response, isn't it? If you nail something down, it's probably not going to like you very much. And so it could be something as simple as that. But looking at morally, what has Eustace done? Is it... I'm not sure that Harvey had this belief, but, is it hubris? You remember the great crime of the ancient Greeks was hubris. If you Icarus, think of Icarus, if you overreach as a human and you step on the toes of the gods and enter onto the realms that are reserved for the gods, then expect punishment. Pride comes before a fall and stuff like that. This theme of... and there are so many stories and movies about humanity thinking itself too big for its boots and actually being punished either by aliens or... I don't know where I got that from. War of the Worlds isn't quite like that. But, or supernatural powers. That happens a lot in horror films. Or natural disaster. And I think a lot of this climate stuff... whether scientifically it's true or not, and most scientists believe it is true, but we're also playing a story that we've told ourselves many times, which is this millennial apocalyptic story. This is a story that humans tell themselves, this is the end of the world. This is the end of the world. No, this is the end of the world. And it's almost like we play into this. This is a theme, and we kind of dress it up with whatever's around at the time. It's going to be... I remember in the 70s, it was the Ice Age. And then there was a book by John Brunner, To Stand on Zanzibar, where the disaster was overpopulation. There was even a Star Trek episode about it, and people were really worried that there'd be too many people in the world, and they had this vision of everybody standing, nobody having any room. And of course now it's the opposite. There's not going to be any people, and people see both of those. They see global warming as the end of the world. They saw them in the Ice Age. The Ice Age is the end of the world, the new Ice Age. They saw overpopulation as the end of the world. They see no population as the end of the world. And it's as if we have this template, this apocalyptic end of the world story we tell ourselves, and we just fit whatever's around, go, yeah, this is it, whether it is or not. I suspect, the truth of it is, whether you like it or not, the world may become very, very hot, but so is Venus. The world will continue. We may all die, and life forms will evolve. There are snails that live in volcanoes, and I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just saying, inevitably it won't be the end of the world. Again, there will be an end of this world one of these days, if we believe astronomers, that the sun will die, but it won't be the end of everything, I don't think. Anyway, I don't know what I'm talking about in that, but there we are. Where was I? The apocalypse. So yeah, that came from hubris, didn't it? The idea that mankind could be too hubristic and overreach its and step into. And I think all this GMO stuff, genetically modified food, there is a real fear that this is what we're doing now. We're just not as clever as we think we are. And you do things to your car or your computer or your central heating, you change one thing, you don't know how to put it right. So it could be that if we introduce these genetically modified organisms into the world, which we already have, we might. And AI is another apocalypse, isn't it? It's another apocalypse story. Anyway, so it's hubris and apocalypse. Is this what's happening to Eustace? He has the temerity to become a scientist. So, and he's an intellectual science. So, the chthonic, I love that word, the deep forces, the irrational forces are symbolized by this unpleasant, nasty, greedy. Is it greedy? It's malevolent, certainly. Hand. And it seems to be self-seeking. God knows what it wants. Excuse me. Who knows what it wants? But don't know. But he's punished poor old Eustace, or it could be simply because he drove a nail into it. But it was very interested in him, and he was very interested in it when it still was attached to his uncle. So I do feel that it was attracted to him because of his scientific curiosity. Yeah, if we wanted to get into sort of psychoanalytical thinking, we talk about these complexes and autonomous complexes, which are sub-personalities, and then we get into all sorts of things like dissociative identity disorder and multiple identity disorder, whereby people can have many sub-personalities, very much like the alien hand. And a lot of these people with brain injuries, they have sub-personalities inside them, and who are autonomous and have their own wants and needs. And certainly in Jungian thought, many of the archetypes, Jung in the Red Book, in the Black Books and the Red Books, is quite clear that these are real personalities. These things he encounters in his unconscious are real. And of course, most of humanity throughout history would agree that there are angelic or demonic intelligences out there in the ether. So there we are. That is sort of related to automatic writing. Remember, this hand writes things, and it can write. I don't know if you know much about automatic writing. It was a big thing in the sort of 19th century, but what we have is, the first tradition we have is in the 16th century, the Elizabethan mathematician, philosopher and occultist, Dr. John Dee, genius, and his roguish seer and clairvoyant Edward Kelly. Edward Kelly was a bit of a criminal. He had his ears chopped for forgery, but he was also a bit into necromancy as well. And he also ended up, he was talking to these angels, the Enochian, so-called Enochian angels, who dictate an alphabet and a language. I've got a book on it here, that they say is the angelic language, and if you master this, you have great magical power. But I haven't mastered it. But Kelly at one point says that the angels say we should have our wives in common. And Dee says, you what? He says, yeah, your wife. Angels say I should sleep with her. Oh, right, okay. Dee sounds a bit gullible in that sense. Anyway, so they have this is in the 1500s. And then a bit later we have, in 1910, there's a book called Gates of Memory by Captain J.W. Bly Bond, and he was an archaeologist working at Glastonbury Abbey, and he, with his seer, Captain Allen, who wasn't his real name, they spoke to these dead monks who told them of the layout of the abbey, and when they dug it up, lo, there it was. And then the bishop found out that this is how he's doing it. He sacked him, fired him, And then we have, of course, W.B. Yeats, famous Irish poet, who he married later in life his wife Georgie Hyde Lees, who had a talent for automatic writing shortly after they got married in 1917. So very much around about the time that this story was written, and he wrote a book called A Vision, and this, he felt he was being given details of great knowledge from the occult realms about the future of humanity. There's been other ones channeled, like Seth Speaks, and of course the famous Course in Miracles, and these big books have been dictated by these superhuman or extra-human intelligences, and skeptics would say they're just full of platitudes and nonsense. Actually, A Course in Miracles seems to be quite Gnostic. That is to say, it's not a stupid book at all, and a lot of the things it says are echoed in Gnostic Christianity and not Gnostic paganism, and also the Indian Vedic traditions, the Sanskrit stuff. So you pays your money and you takes your choice whether you believe it or not. But it's interesting that this, and I think this is 1919. So many people were killed in the First World War. There was a big surge in mediums, and it was a flourishing time for people wanting to consult psychics and mediums in order to get in touch with their loved ones on the other side. And again, whether you believe that is a real talent or possibility, I kind of do, or you believe that some of them were just milking it to make money out of vulnerable people. Yeah, I believe that as well. And because the truth is always somewhere in the murky greyness, and I think I began by saying that's a nice place to end. Anyway, you find when you get into these stories, there's always so much to say about them, and we could have gone on. Now, to wrap up, I don't know if you know, I'm working two things. I'm doing this on GarageBand, which is a free audio editing program. I've used some quite expensive ones in the past, and I don't know about the sound quality. I think the last one I did, people thought it was okay. Let me know if you think there's a problem. Next thing is I'm working with a YouTube coach, David, a great lad, and he's very keen on lives. I think YouTube, where you go live on your phone. And I'm like, yeah, but what do I talk about? I mean, all right, okay. Say I sang on a 10 p.m. British summertime, whatever time that is in the world. I go live and I'm there, and what do I talk about? Because you can't just talk about nout, can you? And I don't think I'm going to be reading stories. And he said, well, do question and answer. And I'm going, yeah, but what do people want to know? They're fascinated. They're really curious about behind the scenes, how you find the stories, why you choose particular stories, how you record them, what are the minefields you have to navigate. And I said, really? And he said, I tell you what, ask them what they want to. So I think I need the questions in advance. So put some comments about what you'd like to know about, and that I might be able to answer. If you ask about what's the secret to world peace, probably not going to be able to answer that one. Is there a cure for, tinnitus, for one thing? That would be good. I'd like to know that. If you know it, tell me. But you can ask me about what microphone do you use. Oh yeah, I know that one. Or you can ask me about which stories do you particularly like. Anyway, you think about it. Hope that's all right. Little Ruby's come back. Did you catch that fly? No, I didn't think you would. There she is. But she's a lovely girl. She's a lovely, aren't you? Yes, you are. All right, bye.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret of the dead come back? Everybody dies, don't they? Some come back. Isn't that so? Isn't that so? Isn't that so? Isn't that so?